All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm in JavaScript, and it's time to get into client-side web APIs. And we're going to start here with an introduction to web APIs. So as it says, we'll start looking at APIs from a high level, what they are, how do they work, how to use them in their code, and how they're structured. So I'm going to give you their definition, then I'm going to talk about my own. What are APIs? An API is an application program interface. As it says, they're constructs made available in programming languages to allow developers to create complex functionality more easily. They abstract more complex code away from you, providing some easier syntax to use in its place. Now, before we go into what they say here, let me try to put this into my own perspective. I liken an API to a contract. All right, I'm in the middle of doing a refinancing on my house. And in order to do that, I had to sign some contracts and do some paperwork. And what that basically said was I agreed to do certain things. And if I did those certain things, the company that was going to provide the refi for me, they were going to do certain things. Well, in the same way, I look at an API as kind of being a contract between you and the software, where the software agrees that it's going to provide different services for you. And in return, you let the software know that you will use those services in the way that they're supposed to be used. All right. I mean, you've all done things like this, where you come out and you bring out a calculator. All right. And if I say 8 and I say x2, what is that? Well, that's 8 times 8, right? So in other words, that's 8 squared if I want to do that. If I do this, there's the square root. If I want the square root of 588 and I press this, there's what I get. I don't know how that happens. Internally in the computer, there is something that's built into the calculator that does that, the wiring, etc. But I agree that if I want to take a number and I want to go and get its square root, that I will do it that way, that I will put in the number and I will hit this button right here. All right, and it'll give me an answer. Well, what they say in here is, as a real-world example, think about the electricity supply in your house or dwelling. If you want to use an appliance in the house, you plug it into the socket and it works. You don't wire it yourself, and you probably don't know exactly what happens when you plug it in. You would care about that if you were an electrician and something didn't work. Most people are smart enough, if they plug something in and it doesn't work, they might know that if they've got a fuse box to look at it, etc. But they're not going to probably go and dig in there and try to fix it themselves. In the same way, as they say right here, if you want to program some 3D graphics, it's a lot easier using it to create those using a built-in application program interface written in a language like JavaScript or Python, rather than try to write it yourself. All right. Let's see. It says, see also API glossary entry for further description. Let's quickly look at that and see what it says. An API, or application program interface, is a set of features and rules that exist inside a software program, the application part, enabling interaction with it through software as opposed to human user interface. The API can be seen as a simple contract. Sound familiar? That's the interface between the application offering it and other items, such as third-party software and hardware. In web development, an API is generally a set of code features that a developer can use in their apps for interacting with components of a user's web browser or other software hardware. And they give some example. Not bad. Client-side JavaScript in particular has many APIs available to it. These are not part of the JavaScript language itself. Rather, they're built on top of the core JavaScript language and they give you extra abilities. It says they generally fall into two categories. Browser APIs, as mentioned, they're built into the browser. All right, for example, the Web Audio API provides JavaScript constructs for manipulating audio in the browser. You don't have to worry about how this is done. You just have to worry about how to use it. Third-party APIs are not built into the browser by default. Generally, as it says, you have to retrieve their code and information from somewhere on the web. For example, the Twitter API, it says there, allows you to do things like displaying tweets on your website. All right. Relationship between JavaScript APIs and other JavaScript tools. It says, above we talked about what client-side JavaScript APIs are and how they relate to the JavaScript language. Let's recap this to make it clearer. JavaScript is a high-level scripting language. It is a programming language built into browsers that allows you to implement functionality on web pages and apps. It's available both on the client side, which is what we're talking about now, and also on the server side using things like Node.js. Browser APIs. Constructs built into the browser that sits on top of the JavaScript language and allows you to implement additional functionality. Third-party APIs, not built in to the browser. All right? But they're in third-party platforms like Twitter or Facebook that allow you to use some of those platforms' functionality in your own web pages. JavaScript libraries, as it says, usually one or more JavaScript files containing custom functions that you can attach to your web page to speed up or enable common functionality. And finally, JavaScript frameworks. The next step up from libraries. Frameworks like Angular, Ember, React, etc. tend to be packages of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and other technologies that you install and then use to write an entire web application from scratch. The key difference between a library and a framework is inversion of control. When you call a method from a library, the developer is in control. With a framework, the framework calls the developer's code. What can APIs do? Well, common browser APIs, as it says there, the most common categories of browsers are APIs for manipulating documents loaded into the browser. And again, we'll talk about these. And we've talked about the DOM already, and we will continue to do so. APIs that fetch data from the server. All right, as it says, they allow you to update small sections of a web page on their own, and they're commonly used. APIs for drawing and manipulating graphics. Audio and video APIs. Device APIs for manipulating and retrieving data from modern device hardware. Client storage APIs. The ability to store data on the client side. If you want to create an app that will save state between page loads. And perhaps even work if the device is offline. Those, again, are basically built-in browser APIs. Common third-party APIs, some of these we've talked about already. Twitter API, MapQuest, Google API, Facebook API. There's other ones. Telegram APIs, YouTube API to allow you to embed YouTube videos onto your site, Pinterest API, Twilio API, Mastodon API, and there's other ones. So how do APIs work? Well, we're doing okay for time. As it says, they are based on objects. Your code interacts with APIs using one or more JavaScript objects. These objects serve as containers for the data used by the API. All right. We've already looked at the JavaScript objects section in here. It says, let's return to the example of a web audio API, a fairly complex API which consists of a number of objects such as audio context, media element audio source node, and audio destination node. It says, so how do these things interact? It says, if you look at a simple audio example, you'll see the following. Well, let's look at it live. Pretty obvious, I think, what's happening right there. First of all, as mentioned, we include an audio element with which we embed an MP3 file onto our page. We don't include any default browser controls. Next we create a button that we'll use to, don't want to do that, that we will use to play and stop the music. So rather than controls, we're using a button for that. And an input element that we'll use to adjust the volume while it's playing. All right, so that's pretty simplistic. The file, the button to play or pause, and the equivalent of the controls. Sorry about that. Don't want to make excuses, but again, having problems with my sinuses this morning. All right. So they explain how they're setting this up in here. They say we start by creating an audio context instance inside which to manipulate the track. Next, we create constants that store the audio button and input elements. Next, we include a couple of event handlers that serve to toggle between play and pause. Next, we create a gain node object, which can be used to adjust the volume of audio fed through it. And the final thing is to connect the different nodes in the audio graph up, which is done using the connect. All right, probably did very little to nothing as far as helping you with this. But again, there is a rhyme or reason. So with an API, you've got basically a set of rules that allow you to do something as long as you follow those rules. When using an API, you should make sure you know where the entry point to the API is. All right, and they mentioned, for example, the document object model. Their API has a simple entry point. Its features tend to be found hanging off the document object. We've looked at some of these. We will continue to look at more of them. The Canvas API, as it says, relies on basically getting a context object to use. That bouncing balls demo, I think that's the one we'd already looked at a while ago. I don't even want to bring it up again, to be honest with you. We already discussed events earlier on in our introduction to events. All right, if you are not familiar, you should go back and look at it. Sure. Some web APIs contain no events, but most contain at least a few. The handler properties that allow us to run functions when events fire are generally listed in the reference manual under the event handler section. We saw a number of them previously. To provide another example, here it says instance of the XHR or XML HTTP request object. All right. It has a number of events available on them. For example, the load event, which is fired in response to successfully returning the resource. It says you can see this code in action in our ajax.xml. Not much in there. Let's go back. Let's just run it. Okay, we saw this before in an earlier example. Web API features are suspect to the same security considerations as JavaScript and other technologies, for example, the same origin policy. But they sometimes have additional security mechanisms in place. Well, think about that, especially if this would be a third-party web API. All right, that you want to make sure that whatever you're getting from some other source can be trusted. For example, some of the more modern web APIs will only work on pages served over HTTPS, which is HTTP with a secure socket layer, due to them transmitting potentially sensitive data. In addition, some web APIs request permission to be enabled from the user once calls to them are made in the code, and they give an example there. Depending on how strict the browser is, such security mechanisms might even stop the example from working locally. At the time of writing, our web audio API example won't work locally on Google Chrome. We have to upload it to GitHub for it to work correctly. So it says at this point, well, we've started to talk about what APIs are. We're going to see them in much more depth and breadth of coverage as we go on in here. So we've done the introduction to web APIs, and next is manipulating documents. I'll be back with that in a couple minutes.